Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off. This is part two of the 1 to 4 family residential contract. Paragraph 7 talks about property condition, all right, access, inspections, and utilities. Okay, the main thing in this paragraph is that seller must allow buyer and buyer's agents access to the property at reasonable times. So if the property is occupied, this means making an appointment and informing the seller what is going to happen. Don't just take it upon yourself that, you can come and go as you please. That's really not what this is meant to do. Reasonable times and be reasonable in terms of informing them. We've had a lot of conflict in the past with agents who, every time the buyer wants to run in there and look at the property, on a daily basis, they go and look. After a while, the seller gets a little bit annoyed that they're being continuously interrupted because somebody wants a measure for drapes or take a measurement for something else, whatever. So keep it to a reasonable time and for reasonable reasons. Okay. Buyer's agents would be licensed inspectors, appraiser, who's ever doing repairs, that type of thing. So all utilities must be kept on by the seller during the contract period. That's another cause for conflict when the seller feels that just because he's not living there, he can shut the electricity off, shut the gas off. You have to remember a buyer is going to be doing an inspection, and that inspector is going to want electricity, gas, water, everything. So make sure that the seller understands that's to be left on. Okay, paragraph 7b is talks about the seller's disclosure. One of the boxes must be checked. So either the buyer has received a notice, or the buyer will receive the notice, or the seller's not required to furnish the notice. So if box 2 is checked, the typical time frame for receiving the seller's disclosure is 3 to 5 days. You want it in a very short period of time because you want the buyer to be able to look at it prior to the end of the option period if he has concerns. All right. Now, one of the key things also is that if the seller delivers the seller's disclosure to the buyer can terminate for any reason within 7 days after receiving the notice or prior to the closing, whichever first occurs. So you see there's almost like another option period in there. Let's say that you have a 7-day option period. They deliver the seller's disclosure on day 6. Well, you still have 7 days after that to terminate the contract based on the seller's disclosure. Okay? Now, another mistake that agents make is that box 1 is checked because the seller's disclosure is available on the MLS as an attachment. That does not constitute delivery, okay? Just because that's out on the MLS, you are required, as a seller or a seller's agent, required to send it and deliver it to the buyer or the buyer's agent, okay? You just can't point them there and say, oh yeah, well, it's on the MLS. No, not good. Box 3 would be checked if the seller was exempt from providing a seller's disclosure. There are 11 possible exceptions. Know them. There's a link here, exemptions from seller's disclosure. Read it and understand it. It's part of the Texas Property Code. 7C informs both parties that if a property was built prior to 1978, you must have a lead-based paint addendum included as part of the contract. Paragraph 7D, acceptance of property condition. Right. This also causes some confusion with agents and, well, not so much with agents, but with buyers and sellers. Because of the term as is, all right, a seller thinks, oh, okay, I'm selling the property as is, meaning, you take it or leave it, I'm not going to do anything, all right? But it's important for an agent to explain to their client what that means. Buyers often misunderstand that they have no chance at having repairs done by the seller. Again, read the language in the paragraph and it explains that the buyer has the right to inspect the property and negotiate repairs in a subsequent amendment. Seller is under no obligation to do so, but the buyer can then terminate if he does not like what he sees in the property. So box 1, buyer accepts the property as is with the potential to inspect during the option period and request repairs be made by seller. Box 2 provides buyer, again, the opportunity to state up front what they would like to have repaired and still go and have inspections later on. So let's say that you approached the property and you found out that the front window of a house was broken. Well, that's an obvious repair. You could put that into D2 there and say, property, seller needs to replace front window of house. Okay. Now, don't put language in there. They're specific about not putting general phrase in there like subject to inspections. That means nothing. In fact, it is confusing, all right, in the sense that if you read the language, if you did that, shall complete the following specific repairs and treatments subject to inspections. You're implying that the seller is going to repair everything that's on the inspection report. Okay, so don't even go there. Be specific in terms of what you want to have repaired up front. Okay. Okay, paragraph 7E, lender required repairs and treatments. It states that if a lender requires repairs and or treatments, neither party is obligated to pay. Right? This could cause a deal to terminate if they cannot negotiate the costs and who's going to pay involved. So, when do we usually see this? We see this with FHA and VA loans, where the appraiser is also an inspector of sorts. They can identify issues that FHA or VA will not accept on the property. One of the examples is improper slope for drainage of water away from the house, or non-working items inside. So those FHA and VA inspectors will then come back and you'll have a lender required repair. Now, what happens at that point if the lender says, okay, this needs to be fixed? Again, neither party is obligated to do anything. If the parties do not agree to pay for the repairs, the contract terminates, earnest money refunded to buyer. Right? If the cost of lender required repairs and treatments exceed 5%, the buyer may terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. Okay? Paragraph 7F, completion of repairs and treatments. This paragraph informs the parties, specifically the seller, about completing any agreed to repairs. Now, look at the language in this paragraph. It's very key that it says here, seller shall complete all agreed repairs and treatments prior to closing. All required permits must be obtained, and repairs and treatments must be performed by persons who are licensed to provide such repairs or treatments, or if no license is required by law, are commercially engaged in the trade of providing such repairs and treatments. Well, what does that exclude? Right off the bat, do it yourself. And this is what happens a lot. A seller says, oh yeah, okay, I'll take care of those. Okay. That does not comply with this paragraph. A do-it-yourself repair is, may be acceptable at face value, but it does not comply with the verbiage in this paragraph. So if repairs are not done by the closing date, buyer can claim default by the seller, or he can extend the closing date 5 days to give the seller more time to make those repairs. That would have to be done in writing and this paragraph referenced. If you send a notice to the seller that the clock is ticking, you have 5 more days. Okay? Paragraph 7G, environmental matters. Right? This is a notice more than anything else. Nobody needs to necessarily do anything, but it advises the buyer that they can have up to 3 separate assessments done to the property: an environmental assessment, a threatened or endangered species assessment, and or a wetlands assessment. All right, there is a form for that. So this would be an addendum to the contract, and it's TREC form 28-2, right, which is telling the seller, I am going to have these types of assessments done. Paragraph 7H is used when a buyer requests that the seller provide a home warranty on the property at the seller's expense. This is a very good negotiating tool, service contract, because it puts the buyer's mind at ease that if anything goes wrong after closing, the chances are it will be repaired by the home warranty contract. So very, very good to get in the habit of using this. So the price varies on the square footage of the property. So you need to talk to a home warranty company to figure out what dollar amount you would put in that blank, because it will vary depending on the square footage of the house. All right. The title company would charge the seller at closing for that cost. All right. And the buyer gets to choose the home warranty company of their choice. A lot of times what a seller will do will say, well, I already have a home warranty on the property. I'll just transfer it to you. That's okay. But, you know, if the buyer wants, they could have their own separate and new, home warranty. Paragraph 8 advises that commissions are not part of the contract and any modifications have to be between client and their agent. All too often I see language in there that, well, buyer's agent is going to give $3,000 towards closing, or somebody's going to give up some kind of a commission to make the deal happen. Now, contract is between a buyer and a seller. The agents are not party to that contract. So a seller cannot obligate commissions from a seller's agent, just as the way a buyer cannot obligate a buyer's agent commission. So any modifications have to be between client and their agent. All right. So in other words, it would have to be as an amendment to a listing agreement or an amendment to a buyer's rep agreement. All right. Once that's done, then you could put language in and say that, all parties have agreed that buyer will give X or seller's agent will give X. So you can do it, but it can't simply be part of the contract that is taking money from either the buyer's agent or the seller's agent. Okay. Paragraph 9, closing. A date is put in there in paragraph 9A, all right, the closing date, and you either have to meet that date or within 7 days after objections are made under paragraph 6D have been cured or waived, whichever date is later. Okay, so if you had if you go back and look at paragraph 6D, if you had an exception that you wanted to have the seller cure, they would have additional time. All right, if closing came and went, they would still have 7 days to cure after the objection. Now at closing, it talks about seller obligations. They're going to give you a general warranty deed. Buyer's going to give them good funds acceptable to the escrow agent. It's pretty self-explanatory at closing what happens. They're going to execute any documents necessary to transfer title to the property. There'll be no liens, assessments, or security interests against the property that will not be satisfied out of the sales proceeds. And paragraph B5, 9B5 is something to pay attention to, because if the property is subject to a residential lease, the seller shall transfer the security deposit, okay, if any, to the buyer. In such an event, buyer shall deliver to the tenant a signed statement acknowledging that the buyer has acquired the property and is responsible for the return of the security deposit, and specifying the exact dollar amount of the security deposit. Okay, I believe there is actually a form in Zip Forms for that purpose, but don't let, if there's a lease involved in a property that your buyer acquires, don't let the seller walk away with security deposit, because you'll never see it again, and guess who will have to wind up returning the security deposit? The new buyer. Okay. Paragraph Sorry about that. Paragraph 10B talks about leases. All right. After the effective date, seller may not execute any lease, okay, or convey any interest in the property without buyer's written consent. Basically, that's saying that once that contract is signed, the seller cannot obligate anything having to do with that property. They cannot write a lease to someone except if the buyer approves of it, of course. Now, if the property is subject to any lease to which the seller is a party, seller shall deliver to buyer copies of that lease and any move-in condition forms signed by the tenant within 7 days after the effective date of the contract. Basically, it says, if the owner is not a resident of the property, but he has it rented, then he must, provide the buyer with any lease documents that exist. Paragraph 11, special provisions. Special provisions allows the buyer and or seller to put additional requirements into the contract, such as repairs. Now, emphasis is on factual statements or business details, not ambiguous language such as offer good until 5 p.m., blah, 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 on a certain date. What happens after 5 p.m.? All right, it makes no sense. There's no consequence there. You don't put language like that in, okay? Don't expect an offer with that language, or don't accept, I'm sorry, there's an error on that one. Don't accept an offer with that language unless it states what happens if not accepted. Remember, if no drop dead date or time is specified or buyer does not withdraw the offer in writing, the offer sits there and seller could execute the contract after the buyer has moved on. And guess what? Now you may own 2 properties, okay? Or be contracted for 2 properties. Do not put information in special provisions for which a form exists, such as leaseback info or similar. Paragraph 12, settlement and other expenses. The first part of it, A1, identifies the required expenses from the seller side at closing. The title company handles all these items, but the seller should be prepared for what they're being charged for. Okay? Paragraph 12A, B, 1B, identifies an amount that the buyer is requesting the seller pay at closing for buyer's closing costs. Some government loan programs may have a fee which the lender may charge the seller, such as termite inspection for a VA loan. That's one of the few things that still exist that may not be. Most of these are not typical. Usually, if there's something in there, it means that the buyer wants seller to pay for some of their closing costs. But the days of government fees that the buyer is not liable to pay, those days are pretty much gone. Okay, you can always change that type of paragraph or what's in that paragraph via an amendment later on. A good guide is seeing the allegiance title, paragraph 12A description. Very good video. (12A2) identifies a buyer's expenses at closing. All right, prior to closing, the title company should provide the buyer with an estimated closing cost statement so that they can clearly see what they are being charged for. Advise, if necessary, with help from the title company. So if the buyer receives this, they're probably going to look at it with a blank stare and wonder what it is. You as a professional should know, what's on there and be able to sit down and go over with them. Paragraph 12B states that if language was put into the contract stating that a party was to pay X dollars for a specific expense, and later that amount was higher than expected, the other party must pay the difference or the first party may cancel. Nothing is said about the disposition of the earnest money in this case, though. So let's read that. It says, if any expense exceeds an amount expressly stated in this contract for such expense to be paid by a party, that party may terminate this contract unless the other party agrees to pay such excess. Buyer may not pay charges and fees expressly prohibited by FHA, VA, Texas Veterans, or other government regulations. All right. Pretty clear. Again, those are not very likely, these government fees that are expressly prohibited by by the buyer to pay. A good example of paragraph B would be later on if there was nothing in the contract, and later on because of the type of loan that a buyer was getting, all of a sudden a fee pops up, and a fee that the buyer is expressly forbidden to pay. Well, if they went to the seller and the seller said, look, I'm not going to pay that because it was not expressly stated in the contract, okay, then that party can terminate the contract, right, unless the other party, which would be the buyer, agrees to pay such excess. But again, there's the conundrum. He's not allowed to do that. So you want to be careful about who's going to pay what, and if it's a reasonable amount of money, and if it meets the requirements of an obligation by buyer or seller.